Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is David Smyth. I'm Director of Monitoring and Intervention at the Office for Students, and I'm going to be the event host for today. So I'll do some very quick introductory things before we can get into the meat of the event. Thank you for coming. We move the slide on. I've just got a few housekeeping things to cover. First of all, I just wanted to say, please do use the chat function you've got to contact the events team if you've got any technical issues at all. They are standing by and able to help with any issues that you've got. Secondly, if helpful, we do have closed captions available. So please do use the CC icon if that is useful for you. Thirdly, just a reminder that the event is being recorded. We will be publishing it on the OFS website later. So you will have a chance to kind of go back and see the event later, and it'll be available to all of you. And finally, and so maybe most importantly, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom to submit questions. We're really keen to encourage people to engage. We've got 2 Q&A sessions at different points through the day, and we've got over 700 people registered for this event. So we hope to have lots of different questions from a wide range of people. Obviously, we're probably unlikely to be able to respond to every single comment and question, but we will do our best to get through as many as possible. Finally, I did want a reminder to follow our social media accounts to continue this conversation. So using the hashtag OFS Insight, and you can tag the Office of Students into discussion. We're at Office Students on Twitter, but other channels and forms of social media are also available, and please look us up wherever you want. So I'll move on now to the agenda. Our programme is going to start with an introduction by our chair, Lord Wharton, and that's going to be followed by a pre-recorded message, which is really kindly been provided by Claire Coutinho MP, who's the Minister for Children, Families and Wellbeing, but has also freedom of speech and education as part of her portfolio. We're then going to hear from the OFS's Chief Executive, Susan Lapworth, and after her address, there's going to be a question and answer session where she and I will attempt to answer questions that have come through so far at that point. We're then going to hear from John Tomasi and Aqua Reindorf. We're really delighted to have both of them here with us today, giving their addresses. And then we're going to have a panel discussion on how can universities and colleges meet their obligations for both freedom of speech and equality. And we're really grateful to our distinguished panel for coming today. They will be giving their own views. They will also be responding to questions and answers that have been raised throughout the day and that are raised during that panel discussion. Finally, Susan will come back and do a brief reflection to close the event, and then we will be done. So a final reminder before we move on to our speakers that you can submit questions which will be picked up both in mine and Susan's session and then in the panel discussion. You can raise those at any point through the Q&A function on Zoom. Hopefully that's all clear to you. And as I said, if there's anything that's not clear, please do use the chat function and our team should be able to help. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Lord Wharton of Yarm for his introductory remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Well, thank you very much for taking part in our Insight event. This is technically our autumn 2022 Insight event, but I think it's more of a Christmas Insight event given the timing now. But I think it's about a really important issue, which is the freedom of speech debate and the freedom of speech legislation and the role that the Office for Students will have as regulator when that legislation comes into effect, and we have to undertake the work that will require. The ultimate principles that underpin this are, I think, pretty universally supported and accepted, whatever the debate around the legislation may be, whatever the view around individual speakers and individual issues may be. It is a cornerstone of higher education in England, in the UK indeed, that freedom of speech and the freedom to debate ideas, alongside academic freedom, allow the development of ideas, the development of theories, the discussion of issues, and the advancement of knowledge. As a higher education regulator, we want to ensure that that is protected where it is needed, and that where support is needed to deliver it, that support is given. The legislation will give us new powers and new responsibilities, which we will be required to undertake. But it's not straightforward. There are a lot of complex issues within the freedom of speech question. There are complex issues around the legal framework and how it interacts with other duties. I know that's going to be some of the topics that will be discussed, how it interacts with the need to provide security and safety and a space in which students can feel welcome and able to study. Because freedom of speech is not just about technically being able to speak, but an environment in which you feel you are able to speak, or an environment in which people are not at risk of being intimidated into not being able to express reasonable and lawful views. There are some, as I say, very complex issues around this, and it is quite a hot topic. We know that it attracts a lot of media attention. We know that when there are examples of what may be freedom of speech being frustrated or being not properly upheld by institutions, that can get an awful lot of coverage in the media. And we also know that trying to explain some of the complexities around the challenges that we as a sector face in dealing with some of these issues can be difficult when also managing media inquiries and the publicity that swirls around those sorts of stories. So there's going to be an interesting road ahead. There are going to be some things that you hear today that you may well not agree with. There may be some things that you hear today that I don't agree with and other members don't agree with. But we're in a position now where we have an incoming legal duty to support and ensure freedom of speech across England's universities. The new powers that we will have as regulator, we will use in accordance with the instructions that we were given and the decisions that Parliament has taken. We will do what the law requires of us. But we want to work with you to ensure that this process is as seamless and smooth as possible, that the issues that are complex around the edges of this are understood, and that obvious traps and pitfalls can be avoided, and good dialogue and understanding of what we will be doing as a regulator and what the law requires will enable institutions and those who are interested in this topic to fully understand exactly what Parliament is requiring of us, and what we are going to need to do, and how it is going to be done. So we're not quite at the final stage yet, but we do know some of the big questions. We do know some of the complex, more difficult areas that we're going to need to explore and work through together to ensure that this is a success. The ultimate goal is one that I would hope everyone can agree with, which is protecting freedom of speech in our higher education institutions, in our colleges and in our universities. That is a good thing in and of itself. What matters now is how we go about doing it. And what we must ensure is that we get a positive outcome that is envisaged by those who have debated this in Parliament and those that brought forward this bill in government. The positive outcome being that free speech is protected and enhanced going forwards because of the vital role it plays in allowing us to have, which we do, a world-leading higher education sector and a world-leading reputation for being a place where views can be freely exchanged and debated. So it's a very important topic. It is, I'm sure, going to be an interesting one. And as I say, there will be a lot of different views. But I think particularly in the areas in which there is complexity and interaction between existing legislation, the new legislation that's coming, and in the areas in which we are, insofar as we know so far today, able to share with you the approach that we're going to be taking, I think that you will find it a useful and interesting one. So thank you very much for taking the time to tune in. I look forward to getting the feedback from the event and to having many other future such events as this on a range of topics as we do, but also to, in the coming year, work alongside you to ensure that the freedom of speech issue is one that is resolved in a positive and constructive way, and that we can look at the role that the OFS will play and the decisions that the government has taken and the way that the higher education sector has reacted and engaged with that, and say that the ultimate outcome has been a positive one. So thank you very much for taking the time, and I'm delighted to hand over to a video which has been sent in for us by Claire Cortino, who is the Minister in the Department for Education, responsible for free speech alongside a number of other issues, new Minister in the role. I had my first meeting with her very recently, very engaged in the issue and keen to progress it, but also someone who has an understanding of higher education from her own background. So I hope you'll find that interesting along with the rest of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Wharton. I'd like to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to you for inviting me to take part in today's event. I'm delighted that so many people have joined today's discussions, and I would like to thank all of you for everything that you're already doing in this important area. Free speech has been the bedrock of progress in our society for centuries. It's been fundamental to the development of our culture, our society, our literature, our science, and our economy. Without the freedom to speak, to express our opinions, we cannot have progress. However, that right is under threat in the very institutions where it should be the most treasured. It's no longer enough simply to say that we believe in freedom of speech. It is vital that we take active steps to protect it now and for our future generations. And universities, as you will all know, have long had a duty to secure free speech. But that duty is no longer sufficient to combat a growing creep of self-censorship. Without action to counter attempts to discourage or even silence unpopular or controversial views, intellectual life on campus for both staff and students will be unfairly narrowed, diminished. Universities are meant to be a place to explore, debate, and challenge ideas in search of truth, ideas, and progress. That is their purpose, which I know that you all know so well. That's why we introduced the Freedom of Speech Bill, because we have been seeing too many examples of academics and students being hounded out for their lawful views, and a growing chilling effect where too many people are afraid to express perfectly legitimate opinions. Our new legislation places a duty on universities not just to protect, but to promote free speech and academic freedom. It will place a duty on student unions as well to promote free speech. Universities should be a melting pot of ideas where disagreement is a sign of strength, not weakness. That's why this legislation is so important and why this government is determined to ensure the active promotion of free speech. Having a process dedicated to taking action where freedom of speech has been suppressed will be critical. The OFS has the expertise and the knowledge of the sector to ensure that the new complaint system is accessible and effective. And we remain resolute in our commitment that people will have the right to go to court if their complaint cannot be resolved through other routes. I'm confident that the bill will go far in protecting and promoting free speech on campuses, and we expect it to receive royal assent early in the new year. My thanks again to the Office for Students for organising today's event, and I hope you have a valuable discussion this morning.
So many thanks to Lord Wharton and the Minister for those introductory remarks. I'm now delighted to welcome Susan Lapworth, Chief Executive of the Office for Students. Susan was appointed as Chief Executive in September 2022, following a period as Interim Chief Executive. She's previously been the OFS's Director of Regulation, responsible for developing and implementing the OFS's regulatory framework. She's also spent over 20 years working in senior roles in a range of higher education providers. And her speech today is entitled Freedom to Question, Challenge and Debate.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming today. I suspect most of you will be familiar to some extent with the Office for Students, but for those who aren't, a few quick words of introduction. The OFS is the statutory regulator for higher education in England, and we want every student to have a fulfilling experience of higher education that enriches their lives and their careers. Our work has two main areas of focus. The first of these is quality and standards. We think all students should have a high quality academic experience which broadens their knowledge and skills and equips them for future work or further study. Our second area of focus is equality of opportunity. That's about ensuring that all students, regardless of their background, can benefit from higher education. Those two things, quality and equality, go hand in hand. We're not doing our job if students disadvantaged by their background are recruited onto poor quality courses with disappointing outcomes. So where does free speech fit into this picture? Students will not have a high quality education if that education is not grounded in freedom of expression. And that's freedom of expression for themselves, for fellow students, and for those who teach or supervise them. All staff and students are entitled to teach, learn, and research in a culture that values vigorous debate, including, or perhaps particularly, in relation to difficult or contentious or discomforting topics. That is the very point of a university. So students are entitled to be taught by people with the widest range of views. We do them a disservice if we seek to protect them from things that might be challenging or upsetting. It is not a high quality experience if lawful speech is limited. In short, at the OFS, we think that free speech and academic freedom are fundamental to our system of higher education. They are foundational principles and they should be guarded vigilantly. Before talking about what that might mean in practice, let me be clear about a few key points. First of all, the OFS has no interest in fighting culture wars or taking sides in contentious debates. Our role is to ensure that lawful speech is protected and that academics are free to teach and research with confidence. They should be able to speak on controversial topics without worrying about their working environment or their careers. And that must be the case regardless of the politics or position of any individual on any topic. So attempts to suppress or censor lawful speech or academic freedom should be robustly challenged, whether those attempts are made by students or staff or others such as foreign states. In saying these things, I'm not willfully ignoring or being naive about the complexities that characterize debates about free speech as they've played out in universities and colleges, in the media and in Parliament over the past few years. And of course, I recognise the deeply contested and personal nature of much of that debate. I also recognise and I sympathise with the passion that drives many commentators and that will, I'm sure, inform our discussions today. This is a debate that goes to the heart of what a university is or should be. It raises fundamental issues and big questions about the pursuit of truth and new knowledge. And it also connects to and is fueled by broader debates in society about identity, harassment and discrimination, the regulation of social media and so on. It's also worth saying that I'm well aware that not everybody agrees about the extent to which free speech is or is not a problem in our universities. The overwhelming majority of campus events, 99.5%, I think, went ahead in English universities in 2020-21. That's good news. But some people use that statistic to suggest that the OFS shouldn't be worried about free speech at all. And we think the issues are more complex than suggested by a small tally of events that don't go ahead or a small number of speakers who are publicly no-platformed. We're more concerned that attitudes and cultural assumptions in the academic environment might mean that some topics are implicitly seen as off limits, or that some books never get onto reading lists, or that people who reasonably disagree on some issues may feel silenced. We've heard each of these concerns from staff and students. And a recent study by King's College London points in a similar direction. It found that 34% of students thought that free speech was very or fairly threatened at their university. And that's an increase of 11 percentage points from 2019. 38% of students thought that universities were becoming less tolerant. So at the OFS, we're clear, this is a real issue and we can't bury our head in the sands and pretend otherwise. So we're looking to universities to also take these concerns seriously. And we're grateful for the steps that are indeed being taken in the sector. Universities should have the confidence to uphold and promote lawful free speech and academic freedom. And having worked in universities for much of my career, I really do understand how hard that can sometimes be for vice-chancellors. So very sympathetic to the challenges here. I now want to consider briefly some of those challenges in addressing these issues effectively on campus. And I say briefly because, as many of you will know firsthand, free speech and academic freedom sit at the confluence of a number of legal and regulatory responsibilities. Some of those responsibilities, not least the OFS's role, will change significantly if legislation currently before Parliament is enacted. For those of you wanting a bit more information, we've published today the latest in our series of insight briefs, and that explores the legal and regulatory framework within which universities and colleges make their decisions about academic freedom and free speech. So do take a look at that when you have time. In particular, that document draws attention to the nature of the statutory free speech duty placed on all institutions in England. They are required to take reasonably practicable steps to secure free speech within the law. So it's an active doing duty. It's about taking steps. Our regulatory questions would focus on understanding the steps a university has taken and asking whether there are other steps that it could or should have taken to secure free speech. So a focus on what the university has done in practice. And our view is that that statutory obligation is likely to entail taking a wide range of steps in practice. For example, we think it's unlikely to be sufficient for a university only to make public statements in favour of free speech, welcome though that always is. The brief also sets out some aspects of the relationship between free speech and equality law, particularly the Equality Act. We know that universities and colleges have been grappling with this and perhaps not always getting it right. Equality concerns are sometimes presented as pushing against freedom of speech on campus. We don't think that's right, but we do agree that the Equality Act requires careful consideration. It contains the Public Sector Equality Duty, the PSED, which is a duty to have due regard to the need to achieve various aims, such as eliminating discrimination and harassment and advancing equality of opportunity for people who share one of 9 protected characteristics. But it is not a duty to achieve those things. Universities and colleges should, of course, be clear about the particular equality implications of their policies and decisions. They should recognise the desirability of achieving those aims in the PSED, but they must do that in a way that does not undermine the importance of free speech and academic freedom, particularly in higher education. So the free speech duty requires universities to act, whereas the PSED requires them to think about various matters as they act. We see universities and colleges sometimes getting this statutory framing of the PSED wrong, and we're concerned that this means that they may be, perhaps inadvertently, curtailing lawful speech. In other words, they may not be taking steps that are reasonably practicable to secure lawful speech, because they've wrongly decided to take steps to achieve in practice the various matters in the PSED. The Equality Act is also relevant because of its prohibitions on discrimination and harassment. And again, these relate to the protected characteristics defined in the Act. We sometimes see institutions having difficulty with these provisions too. For example, they might not always get the protected characteristics right. They might refer to other characteristics that aren't protected, or they might use incorrect definitions. They might focus on just one protected characteristic rather than considering all those that are relevant. They might define harassment too broadly. For example, they might fail to capture the objective elements of the legal concept of harassment, such as whether it's reasonable for a person to feel humiliated or intimidated by another person's conduct. That all sounds quite technical. We're regulators at the OFS, so we like technical. But why does it matter in the real world? I think it matters very much because it's freedom of speech and academic freedom that are within the law that have protection. There is no need to point to a specific legal basis for particular speech, and the starting point is that speech is permitted unless it is restricted by law. These provisions in the Equality Act allow us to identify instances where speech may be restricted by law. So, for example, policies that define harassment too broadly and so conflate what may be lawful speech with harassment may act to curtail free speech. Where academic staff could be subject to disciplinary action if they convene such a policy, that policy may interfere with academic freedom for those staff. So these are fundamentally important issues that determine whether speech may be unlawful, rather than just technical matters that endlessly fascinate my colleagues at the OFS. The publication of our insight brief today is a signal to the sector that these legal issues may need a fresh look, and we're inviting you to do that now in good time before any new OFS powers come into effect. I'll end with a few words about the future. We know that new legislation in England is likely to strengthen the obligations placed on universities and colleges and their student unions. And the OFS will have stronger powers to intervene where we have concerns about free speech or academic freedom. In upholding free speech, universities recognise that they have to uphold the rights of those whose views are seen by some as offensive. The new legislation reinforces that point. Universities can't duck difficult questions or the contested debates that swirl around in the higher education sector and across society more broadly. The OFS can't duck them either. And as I said earlier, we have no interest in fighting culture wars or taking sides. We must and we will apply our understanding of the law to the facts of an individual case. And we'll do that with care and the utmost impartiality. We recognise that some of the decisions we'll make on these issues may be unpopular and people will disagree with us. But freedom of speech and academic freedom have always been essential features of higher education in England, and we intend to ensure that that remains the case.
Thanks a lot, Susan. Yes, my video's on now. Thank you for that, and we're going to move on to some questions and answers now. I was going to say that there'd been not quite as many as expected, but a few more have zipped in, so I'm sure that we will have enough to get our teeth into. So to start off, I think the first question, which I think we had a few people who've raised things that touch on, is free speech being stifled in English universities, and if so, what is the scale of the problem?
Well, yes, we're concerned that it is being stifled. We've set out in the insight brief that we published today a range of sources of evidence. We know that some of that's contested, and we kind of present it in that context. As I said a minute ago, we know that the headlines are often focused on a small number of high-profile events, but I don't think that's the whole story. And we can see a common theme across recent reports and studies, and also from the notifications that come into us, that suggests that this chilling effect, this inhibition of free speech is a real and live issue in higher education. So robust debate being discouraged in a way that's got nothing to do with those high profile, platforming events. And of course, the problem with people being reluctant to speak is that it's difficult to quantify the problem, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, I think.
Okay. And then another one, again, there's comments that link to, you said about the OFS standing for free speech within the law, but there's quite a lot of speech which kind of may be lawful, but maybe sort of very deeply offensive in one way or another, maybe seen as racist, as prejudiced, as also as creating an upsetting and exclusionary environment for some groups of students. So how can the OFS approach speech like that?
Yeah, I think this gets to the nub of the issue, doesn't it? So I've just said universities' obligations for free speech and academic freedom relate to any lawful speech. So I'm going to be blunt. If it's lawful, people get to say it, and that's the fundamental point we're making today. But we're also looking to universities to take steps to help their students understand that that's the deal in higher education, that it's important that they encounter views and ideas they may not agree with and that they might find really uncomfortable. And that's the case in the classroom, but more broadly in their higher education experience. So I think we do students a disservice if we're trying to protect them from things that they might find challenging or upsetting. And universities, I think I'd encourage them to think about what more they can do, what other steps they can take to support students into the environment that we're describing here, where free speech within the law is kind of prized and protected.
Thanks, that's helpful. So another question that we've had, which is really interesting actually on how we approach free speech and its importance, is how do universities balance the rights of people who want to hear a speaker against the free speech rights of those who want to protest against that speaker, given that sort of both of those sets of people, usually both those sets of students, have kind of important free speech rights?
Yeah, I mean that must be right. mustn't it? So you have to look at both sides of that dynamic. So you see this play out with events, don't you? So the people wishing to organise and participate in events have free speech rights, and we would expect universities to be taking those reasonably practicable steps to secure speech in that context. But protesters have rights too. So again, the university needs to be taking reasonably practical steps to secure the speech rights of the protesters. I think where it gets difficult is where one side is trying to shut the other down. And we would want to look really carefully about how a university had handled that balance, how it had made judgments about the steps it should take to make sure that both sets of speakers get to be heard. I think it feels really difficult to support an environment where some views get shut down because of organised protests of one kind or another.
Yeah, I suppose there's a really important difference between silencing disagreement and protest, which is silencing one sort of speech, versus allowing protest to take a form which sort of literally prevents certain views being heard. And I think that makes sense in terms of what we've talked about the legal limitations, or you can only restrict freedom of speech in including freedom of protest in certain contexts, and that would include, you'd have to be thinking about pursuing an aim of kind of protecting other people's rights and freedoms, for instance, alongside restrictions being proportionate. So I think that all makes sense. It must be very difficult in individual cases.
Yes, and there are and we need to remember there are limits to the convention rights to protest. So I think what we're highlighting is some of the complexities here, and perhaps that's one of the key messages for today. I invited in my speech universities to take a fresh look at their legal obligations and make sure they really understand them, and I think this is one of the issues where that complexity perhaps does need a fresh look.
Yeah. So we've talked, I think a few times about free speech and academic freedom, and we've had some questions saying, but aren't those different things? How will we navigate the distinction between free speech and academic freedom?
Yeah, so our view is that academic freedom is a component of freedom of speech, so it fits within that freedom of speech umbrella. I think what the academic freedom obligation that we impose through our regulatory requirements does is it makes it clear that academics have a particular role in society in relation to these issues. So it's literally their job to question and test received wisdom and put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions. And what our framing of that academic freedom principle does is it says they have to be able to do that without being worried that they're going to lose their jobs or privileges. So it's drawing particular attention to a set of protections that apply to academic staff that relate to the particular role that they have. And I think seeing that as part of a broader landscape and a broader legal landscape on freedom of speech is helpful, rather than seeing it as a separate set of issues.
Thanks. There's a question, shows a concern for us, which I think is always welcome. Does the OFS expect to have enough internal capacity to deal with freedom of speech work alongside all the other things that we're doing? And is it expected that this is going to form a kind of large part of our work?
Well, I don't know. This is your team, David. I should perhaps kind of chuck that back at you. What do you think?
So I mean, I think as with most things, to a degree, are how much of a part of our work it forms depends on events, depends on what arises, depends on what we see in the sector. But what I would say is I think this is a really significant area, as we've said. It's kind of linked to our kind of the core of what higher education is about. And so I don't think it's an area that we would want to sort of pass over lightly. I think it's something where we would want to have a sort of proper focus on making sure that the requirements are well understood, including the new requirements, any new requirements brought in by the bill, assuming it passers. And so I think we would want to give it kind of enough attention to make sure that we were sort of confident that universities and colleges really understood, you know, what they were doing in this area, and that we could confidently see that the right things were being done.
I think that's right. It's not an accident that freedom of speech is a goal within our new strategy. So we've been clear that it's an important part of our programme for the next 3 years. And as I framed it earlier, we see free speech issues as a necessary underpinning for a high quality higher education. So we look at it in that context. I don't want to prejudge Parliament's decisions about the legislation, but one of the things that the bill would do, if passed as it's currently configured, is to require the OFS to operate a complaint scheme, and we've not done that before, so that's new work that will take some thinking through. But that will mean that we're required to consider and reach a view on every complaint that comes to us. So I think that points to an increased volume of activity in this area, at least over the medium term, that will mean that we're talking about this issue quite a lot, and that we will have it in our minds on a routine basis.
Yeah. And another sort of fairly sort of practical questions. There've been several queries raised about kind of specific examples and whether we will be providing kind of concrete examples of the sorts of actions we would expect universities to be taking in this area.
So yes, the insight brief we've published today, I think is a helpful account of our current view of how the law in this area works, and some of the issues that we have seen in the sector as we've looked at various examples. So I think that's our kind of first clear explanation of where we think that this territory sits. Again, if the bill is passed by Parliament, one of the other things that it will require us to do is to impose new conditions of registration on all universities and colleges registered with us, and colleagues in the sector will kind of know what that entails. That entails a consultation where we set out the requirements in a condition and the guidance that sits underneath that. So I expect that the guidance in that context will tease out some examples to help universities to understand how we would think about those obligations and the sort of approach that we might take in looking at compliance cases. So I can see more of that coming in the future as and when the bill is passed and we pick up those new responsibilities.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and also, of course, that, you know, as the assuming that again the sort of complaints system as proposed is introduced, you know, we will start to see kind of real cases coming through, and that will help people see kind of what happens in practice, which is, you know, kind of what's helpful. And I think, you know, providers see that when they look at kind of decisions of the OIA and what other universities do in it before things even reach the OIA. So that starts to give some sort of concrete examples, real examples, as well as kind of hypothetical examples that people can work from.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, and it's true about our casework beyond free speech. The sooner we can start to surface real examples of the work we've done and the views we've taken, then I think that will help everyone to see what it looks like for real rather than in theory. Yeah.
We've also had some questions relating to students' unions. So kind of, will we be publishing guidance for students' unions? Will we need to independently register students' unions if the bill is passed?
Yeah, so this is this would be a kind of pretty big new thing for us. We don't currently have any regulatory remit over students' unions, so new for us, but perhaps more importantly, new for them too. They're not used to being regulated by us in this context, and I think the guidance for student unions will need some real care. they're less equipped and less able than, for instance, a big university might be to deploy teams of lawyers and policy experts to navigate their way through some of these complexities. So I think we're going to have to do more to help them to understand what the issues are, what the law requires of them, and how they might think about the implications of that. So I think I would see that as a discrete strand of work that we would need to pick up. You asked whether they'd have to register. I don't think the mechanism works that way. So I think universities have to tell us if they have a relevant student union, and then we develop a relationship with that student union for the purposes of monitoring. So it's slightly softer than the current registration arrangements for universities.
Yes, and the kind of regulatory interaction is new, but I suppose these are things that student unions have been having to sort of think about, or should have been thinking about for some time. So it would be really interesting to have that kind of engagement.
Yes.
We've had I mentioned the OAA a second ago and their complaint scheme. We had a question about if we do have a complaint scheme on this in particular introduced, how do we feel that will interact with the OAA's kind of wider complaints remit?
Yes, I mean we've always worked closely with the OIA because we have kind of shared interests on a range of topics. So nothing new in that sense. I think we would, each of us, want to be as clear as possible in guidance for students, because of course staff can't take complaints to the OIA, but would be able to bring a free speech complaint to the OFS. But really clear in guidance for students to help them navigate which complaint scheme they might need to use. So that feels quite important. And then the OIA are old hands at complaint adjudication in a way that just now we're not. So some lessons to be learned from all of their good work over the years. So we will absolutely be picking their brains and understanding from their perspective what works and what doesn't in this space.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely must be the case. And it's really good to have that already sort of a sort of well-established part of the system and the sector here. We've only got a few minutes left, about 4 minutes, so we can hand over to the next section. So we'll keep these brief. There've been some questions here, and these are questions that we have in other areas too, quite rightly, about how the OFS set expectations in this area. For sort of small organisations, considering regulatory burden, and that's kind of small providers, but also questions have raised, for instance, sort of further education student unions, which are sort of small organisations, not registered charities. So how do we deal with those kind of smaller organisations and avoid unnecessary burden?
Yeah, I mean that's always a concern for us, and something we think really carefully about. It's tricky in this area. If the bill is passed, then it requires us to impose mandatory conditions of registration, and it requires us to regulate student unions, and it requires us to operate a complaint scheme. So we're not being, on the basis of the current drafting, given discretion by Parliament to decide to do those things or not. So in that sense, the regime applies to all providers in the same way, regardless of scale. I think when we think about guidance, we'll, as we always do, think carefully about how it's helpful to do that for providers that perhaps don't have the capacity to think about these issues. And then, as we're talking, I'm wondering whether that framing of taking reasonably practicable steps is kind of helpful here, because what might be reasonably practicable for a large wealthy university might not in the same way for a very small institution or indeed a student union. So there's something in the framing of the statutory duty itself that I think is directly relevant to the size and the shape of an institution. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think there's, we can't, particularly when it's a statutory requirement anyway, we can't say that the same principle doesn't apply to a smaller provider, or that, freedom of speech of providers, freedom of speech of students and academic freedom of staff kind of matters less at smaller providers. But yes, in terms of the substantive requirement, what may be reasonably practical for a very small organisation is different to one that's got much more resources and ability to resolve certain things. And also, as you say, I think across our work we try to maintain those kind of common standards and expectations in principle, but always kind of look to see whether the way that we kind of regulate it in practice can be adjusted for considerations of kind of what's practical and proportionate. That was really helpful, Susan. Having said towards the beginning of the session, there aren't that many questions. We've now had more questions flood in than we've been able to address. So we will be trying to pull more of those together so that the panel later will have lots and lots to chew on. But thanks a lot, Susan, for your remarks and also your response to Q&A there. I'm now going to move to introduce John Tomasi. So John Tomasi is the inaugural president of Heterodox Academy, which is a global community of academics and students based in the United States, which promotes open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in institutions of higher learning. John himself is a political philosopher. So prior to joining the Heterodox Academy, he was the Romeo Alton 1843 Professor of Natural Theology at Brown University. I should say John is joining us from the United States due to the time difference. This is very, very early in the morning in the United States, so we're particularly grateful to him for speaking at this time. And his speech is entitled "Disciplined Speech: An American Perspective." And with that, I will hand over to John.
Hi there. I'm John Tomasi. I'm just really delighted to be here. I want to thank the Office for Students for inviting me to speak with you today. It's an extremely important moment in education across the world, and especially so in the UK. We've all been following the events that you're passing through with great interest, and I'm really honored to be here. It is, as just mentioned a little bit earlier for me here, that it is for you there. And it's also regrettably the fact that I'm not a morning person, and yet here we are. So I'm really happy to be here. Now let me see if I can, despite not being a morning person, share my screen just for a few minutes. Let me get up what I want, sorry. I'm the president of Heterodox Academy. It's an organization of professors and administrators who love our universities, who believe they can be reformed from the inside. There are a lot of critics of universities, obviously, but we're people who share many of the concerns that the critics have. And that our approach is to try to work from the inside to working with administrators and with our fellow colleagues on the faculty and with our students in our classrooms to create better experiences for students. And our mission is to improve the quality of teaching and research, basically by trying to change the culture within universities, by encouraging these three values: open inquiry, which means something like letting curiosity be free, and viewpoint diversity, which in these polarized times is often read to mean left versus right politically, and that is an important dimension of diversity that we care about. But we mean diversity much more widely than that. We mean viewpoint diversity, including the viewpoints of diversity that comes from different experiences, different communities that one's a member of, different religious viewpoints, different deep views of the world. And then we're also, my favorite is our third value, which is constructive disagreement, which to me means something like learning how to listen to each other, finding ways past our biases, past the anger and distrust that so often people feel in our society these days, to try to find a way to remind ourselves that we're scholars together, we're learners together, and that's a great adventure that we can be on together if we can find the strength of character within ourselves to open those doors. And HXA, Heterodox Academy, we're the world's largest membership organization of professors and administrators committed to these values. We have 5,500 plus members now. We're all across the academy. Our top disciplines are psychology, philosophy, political science, economics, and history. We're increasingly moving into STEM, and have a large presence now in medical schools. We're in 49 states in the US. The only state we're not in is Hawaii, which I'm saving for a recruitment trip, perhaps in February, to get at least one member to join us. And we're in 57 countries. And I'll just say, one last thing I'll say about us is that those three values are what we are as part of our mission: open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement. But more generally, we try to encourage ways of being on campus. We encourage these ways of being in the way we teach, in the way we interact with our colleagues in department meetings and in our research. And we have something that we've taken to call the HXA way, which you can see there on the screen, I hope. Make your case with evidence. So, show the facts, revert to facts when we have some. Be intellectually charitable, which means don't just straw man your opponents, try to steel man your opponent. Be intellectually humble and be aware that there are giants and we are standing on their shoulders in various ways, whoever we are. And that's something to keep in mind whenever we have a strongly held opinion that maybe we're wrong about that opinion. There's always more to learn. Be constructive, which means to look for the good in what people are saying rather than sort of leaping to what's bad in what they're saying. And then be yourself, which just means that each of us is a person at the end of the day. We sometimes inhabit roles and are seen to play these roles on campus, but in fact, at the end of the day, we're all just individual people doing our best in this world, and it's good to remember that. So I'll stop sharing now. And I want to invite you to, I know the incredibly important issues that you're talking about here today and you've gathered to discuss. What I want to do is to try to step back, or invite you to step back with me, to take sort of a broader view and to consider a question I think is prior to a lot of the specific questions that are roiling the UK about statutory torts and other really interesting developments. And I want to invite you to consider with me this question of what's the ideal of speech that's appropriate within a university. And I'm going to suggest that ideal is something that I call disciplined speech. And I'm going to contrast disciplined speech with free speech. And I'm going to suggest that of those two, it's disciplined speech that we should care most about within the context of the university. To talk about speech and the kind of speech we should care about within universities and we should seek to protect within universities, I think we have to think about a concept that's right behind that, which is the idea of knowledge. So, as mentioned, I'm a philosopher, and I'm a philosopher, and I'm going to do a little bit of philosophizing with you. It won't be painful, I promise. I want to talk with you about knowledge. And when I talk about knowledge, about the kind of knowledge we value at the university, that'll help us see, I think, the kind of speech we value at the university. So let me give a word about knowledge. And I'm going to begin with a philosopher's example, but it's a homey one, and I hope you won't mind. So I own a blue Subaru Outback. It's a clunker of a car, but I love it. I think when I first bought the Outback, I thought it was made in Australia. But even when I found out that it wasn't, I still loved my car. This morning, I got up, made my cup of coffee, a big cup of coffee, and I drove my Outback onto campus, and I parked it outside my door at the entranceway of the building. Now, if someone asked me, "Is there a blue Subaru Outback parked outside your building right now?" I would say, yes, there's a blue Subaru Outback parked outside my building. I just drove it there. I parked it. I walked in. But now imagine with me that when I drove up this morning, a thief was watching me, and he saw me go outside my car like a professor with my papers, fumbling around, kind of stumbling around, in fact. And I dropped my keys on the ground, but didn't notice that. And I eventually walked into the building with my papers, thinking about this talk. The thief, seeing his opportunity, picked up my key, climbed into my car, and sped off. And as he was peeling out of the entrance to the parking lot, imagine one of my colleagues who also happens to be an owner of a blue Subaru Outback, was slowly driving into the parking lot, looking around for an open space, seeing the one that had just been vacated by my car, and drove her car to a stop in my parking spot. Now, remember, as before, I, sitting here now, if those events had all occurred out there, I, sitting here now, believe that there's a blue Subaru Outback parked outside in the parking lot. And in fact, it is true that there's a blue Subaru Outback parked outside in the parking lot. In fact, exactly where I think it's parked. So I believe something, and the thing that I believe is true. It's a certain accomplishment of knowledge. And yet, I think you'll agree with me that something's gone wrong with my understanding about the state of affairs in the parking lot. Philosophers would say that I lack justification for my belief, for my true belief, and therefore lacking justification, not being connected to the information in the right way, not being connected to that truth in the right way, means that my knowledge is defective or I have no knowledge at all. What philosophers mean when they say that is that I don't really understand the situation about my car in the parking lot, that I lack depth of appreciation for the state of affairs regarding my car in the parking lot, that in some sense, some important sense, I missed the story. I missed the drama of what happened this morning, what led there to be that particular now blue Subaru Outback in the parking lot out there. My knowledge, the kind of knowledge I have, is two-dimensional. It's truncated. Even though I have the belief that it's true, something fundamental is missing. Now, that may sound like an irrelevant or an abstract philosopher's point, and I suppose it is one. But let's take the same thing. Let's do the same thing again. But this time we'll do it in the context of higher education. So imagine a first-year student, as we used to call a fresher at Oxford. Imagine the student arriving on campus, fervently believing some piece of ideological view. So imagine she arrives on campus fervently believing, let's say, the most extreme predictions about climate change. There are various models. There's a consensus on some general issues, of course, but now this person believes the most extreme of the available models about climate change. Believing that in fact, this situation is as dire as the most extreme predictions make possible, she also fervently believes in extreme remedies. So she believes what the US AOC calls the Green New Deal, and maybe a souped up version of the Green New Deal. Why does she believe this? Why does she believe this theory? She believes it because when she was 16, she watched a TikTok video and saw her favorite pop star, or perhaps AOC herself, predicting the end of the world as we know it and advocating a souped up version of the Green New Deal. So as a 16-year-old, she saw this TikTok video, was just taken with it, and therefore became convinced that these things were true. As a result of this firmly held belief of hers, she never took a course on climate change while she was at the university. She never took a course on climate science of any kind. She never learned what a climate model is, or that there was more than one climate model, and how that makes it interesting for us to try to figure out which model is the best one to go with. She also never studied public policy or economics. Thus, she has no idea about the concept of opportunity cost. She doesn't know that debates about energy policy are deeply connected to the debates about economic development. In the dorms, when she spent time in her evenings in the dorm with her friends, she never seriously discussed climate change with her fellow students, except, say, with friends who shared her exact view, and other people in the dorm who would express views that were deviant from her view. On encountering them, she would just roll her eyes and walk away and not listen. She never attended public lectures on climate science, unless the speaker agreed with her. Or perhaps if she did, she went there to shout down or heckle a speaker who deviated from her doctrinaire view. But now imagine that 10 years after she graduated, a robust scientific consensus emerged on a specific model of climate change. And that consensus turned out to be that the most extreme earlier prediction was correct. So what that student heard on TikTok turned out, alas, to be true. That is, it is as bad as the most extreme models predict. And it is therefore also true that as a matter of public policy, very extreme measures are necessary immediately. Imagine saying that 10 years from now, that proved to be true. What would we say now about this student? What would we say about the education, her educational experience that she received in higher education? What would we say about her quality of understanding that had been afforded to her by her experience in 4 years on the university? Granted, as the case with the Subaru, granted, the thing she believed, the fact that she believed, because she watched a TikTok video, the fact that she believed turned out to be true. But I don't think that we think much of her educational experience, neither the way she approached it or what the university delivered to her. She'd be a lot like me and my blue Subaru Outback. When it comes to climate change, we might say about her, she never understood. She never came to understand the situation. Her appreciation of the problem and the range of solutions never deepened. Her view was two-dimensional, just like my two-dimensional view about there is a blue Subaru out there, not knowing all the drama that had happened. She completely missed the story, we might say. She missed the drama, missed out on the drama. She was not a participant in any way in the great journey of discovery that people at universities especially have been engaged on that led them finally to the regrettable consensus on climate change. We would say that her knowledge, her form of understanding, was deeply defective, even though true. Now I mention all that, I say all that, so I want to emphasize that the kind of information, the kind of understanding that we seek at universities, that we seek to impart to our students, that we seek to develop and practice ourselves as researchers, is really more about the reasons and the understanding and the context and a deepening of our appreciation of our world than it is about particular facts. That means to me that thinking about those reasonings, those forms of justification, those forms of understanding is what we're truly about at the university. Now, if that's true, that means that what's valued on campus is something even more than truth. It asks us for sophistication, for multi-sidedness, for nuance, for something like expertise. And that conception of what kind of knowledge we value at universities bears directly on the kind of speech that we value at universities. The forms of speech and expression that should be valued most on university campuses. In the US, we talk a lot about the First Amendment, which protects wide freedoms of expression, wider even than in the UK, though we got the ideas from you guys, of course. The First Amendment protects silly forms of expression, and it should. It protects the forms of expression of pop stars on TikTok. I don't actually watch TikTok, but I gather there are pop stars on TikTok, perhaps. Fuzzy animals too, presumably. The First Amendment also protects consequential forms of expression. For example, the heated forms of speech that we find in political campaigns, distortions and exaggerations and all. But what of universities? Well, at universities, there's a special subspecies of speech that's connected to the form of knowledge I was just describing. I call this subspecies disciplined speech. Disciplined speech is speech that is disciplined first by its commitments to evidence. Remember, the first of the values of the HXA way, make your case with evidence. That is, don't just give your opinions and your views and what you feel. You can do that too. But as you start to get serious and you want to communicate with others, refer to common things, or at least potentially common things. Refer to things outside of yourself, things that have been developed by experts with knowledge in these fields in that deeper, richer sense, and use those as touchstones, common touchstones, to continue your disagreement in a more enlightened way. So disciplined speech is disciplined first by its commitment to evidence and to reasoned analysis, to not just go to emotion, not just to go to your personal experience, though that can be relevant, of course, but also to always seek those common touchstones that could provide the possibility of communicating together about speech. Disciplined speech is also disciplined because it's informed by the mainstream findings of relevant disciplines. Disciplined speech is literally disciplined in this sense. It means that if you're going to talk about climate change or about any important public policy measure that our world is facing, you should understand some of the basic ideas of how economists and public policy practitioners use the tools of their fields. You should know what opportunity cost is. You should know what a cost-benefit analysis is. And if you're interested in science and the sciences themselves, you should understand what a climate model is. You should learn the mainstream findings of these disciplines. You should be able to use those in your conversations. And those are the marks of an educated person. There's much more that I could say about how that conception of speech, disciplined speech, bears on the questions, the regulatory questions that you're dealing with in the UK on a national level, and we're dealing here in the US with on a state level, though who knows, we may soon be dealing on a national level too, following you guys yet again. But I've reached my 15-minute limit, so I'll stop there. I'd just like to say again that it's a kind of speech, a disciplined speech that I hope you'll think about. Hope you'll think back about the deeper issues. What are you trying to achieve? What kind of community, what kind of experiences for students are we really after? And I hope you'll think about evaluating statutes and possibilities and regulations and the implementation of those regulations in ways that keep that all in mind. Again, thank you so much for having me here. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. Take care.
Thanks so much, John, for that. Thanks so much. Absolutely fascinating, really interesting sort of way to approach it, and sort of new angle on these important issues. What I hadn't heard put quite that way before, but really grateful for that. I'm now going to move straight on to introduce Aqua Reindorf. Aqua is a barrister at Cloisters Chambers and commissioner at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She specialises in employment discrimination and human rights law with a focus on the higher education sector. Aqua is the author of the 2021 Reindorf Review for the University of Essex, which investigates allegations that 2 visiting academics have been no-platformed because of their views on trans rights. And her speech, which picks up, I think, some of the questions that we've had so far today, is harassment, hate and offence versus freedom of speech in the academy. Where does the law draw the line?
Hello, can everybody see me? I can't see me. Well, I'm going to assume that you can all see me, or at least see my slides, which is the main thing. In fact, probably the better option. I'm afraid I'm not used to talking to 700 people who I can't see, so I feel like I'm talking into the void, but let's see how we get on. I'm going to be changing gear a bit from John's very interesting and thought-provoking contribution, because I'm going to be doing the boring bit, which is a whistle-stop tour of the various legal instruments that come into play when a higher education institution, which I will just call a university in my short speech, has to decide whether something that an academic has said or done is, on the one hand, an exercise of freedom of speech or academic freedom, or on the other hand, amounts to harassment of others in the university community. And a few general comments first. I'm under no illusion about how difficult this is in practice for universities. I know that universities and the people who work and study within them want to be both an inclusive, welcoming and safe environment, and at the same time ensure that there can be robust and challenging debate, and that academics and students can be free to push boundaries. And I know that increasingly there's perceived to be a clash between those aspirations. The law is to some extent, in my view, to blame, because there's a lot of it and it doesn't fit together very neatly. But there's also a lot of politics, as we know, and a lot of misinformation and disinformation, particularly on the internet, about this. But I think that there are two fairly simple propositions that can be stated with some confidence. Proposition one is that the law recognizes that the foundational significance of freedom of expression in academia and regards it as vital to the production of knowledge. And proposition two is that the law of harassment is more than capable of taking proper account of proposition one. So that's the basis on which I will proceed to go through my slides. I'm going to be doing a bit of a Chris Whitty because I don't have control of my own slides. So I shall be asking somebody else to be changing them for me. We won't get through all of them because it's a short speech, but you'll be able to look back over the video. So slide one, please. Oh, coming, there we are. What is freedom of expression? I'm sure that everybody here knows that freedom of expression is principally set out in Article 10(1) of the European Convention on Human Rights. It includes holding opinions and receiving and imparting information, and it can't be interfered with by public bodies. Next slide, please. And a public body includes a university in the exercise of its public functions, but not necessarily in the exercise of its employment functions, but also courts and tribunals when they're applying the law. So when they're applying the Equality Act, for instance, they will need to do it through the prism of Article 10. Next slide, please. The rights guaranteed in Article 10(1) of the ECHR overlap to quite a degree with the rights in Article 9, which it provides for freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Article 9(1) has an absolute right to hold a belief. I've said any belief there, but actually it's almost any belief, which we'll come on to in a moment. And Article 9(2) gives a qualified right to manifest belief, and that means essentially to express your belief. And if you recall from Article 10(1), holding an opinion and receiving and imparting information were part of that. So it's a considerable overlap. Next slide, please. Article 10(2) talks about when freedom of expression can be restricted by a public body. Usually it's the government, but it can be something like a university as well. And it's important just to be aware that in Article 10(2), there are really two steps to justifying a restriction of freedom of expression. First of all, the restriction has to be prescribed by law, and I'm going to come on to what that really means. And in addition to that, it has to be necessary in a democratic society to restrict the speech for one of the reasons which is set out in Article 10(2). And I've put most of them there, not all of them, because they're not all relevant. And freedom to manifest belief, which we looked at a moment ago in Article 9, is subject to very similar restrictions. Next slide, please. So prescribed by law sounds similar to the phraseology that we see elsewhere quite often, which is free speech within the law. It's not the same thing. It doesn't mean that the speech itself has to be lawful. It means that the speech can only be restricted if there is a lawful basis for restricting it. So if there is a law which enables, in domestic law, which enables the public body to restrict that speech, like the law of harassment or a criminal offence or something of that sort. And even then, importantly, it can only be restricted in a way which is within the categories like the rights to protect the rights and freedoms of others in Article 10.2, and is proportionate. And proportionality is really important here, because it means that just because some speech that somebody has put out, some expression is that there's a lawful basis for restricting it, and in order to, and it's necessary to restrict it in order to protect the rights and freedom of others, you can still only restrict it if you're a public body in a way which is proportionate. So that means you don't get to just ban it altogether necessarily. You might be able to find a less intrusive way of imposing a limitation on it. Next slide, please. Under the ECHR, there are different levels of protection for different types of speech, which is where we're starting to come closer to academic freedom. There is higher protection for speech intended to inform than speech intended to annoy. And there is very high protection, the utmost protection. Well, there's very high protection for things like political expression and journalism and academic expression. Academic expression has the utmost protection. Next slide, please. There are a few principles which are also, again, probably very well known to most of you. The first is the right to speak only inoffensively would not be a right worth having. And so Article 10 and Article 9 are not limited to only inoffensive speech. Speech which shocks, offends or disturbs can only be restricted in line with Article 10.2 if there's a lawful basis and it's done in a proportionate way. And I've put a quote, very familiar quote from Redmond Bate there. The heretic, the eccentric and so on are protected. Next slide, please. Another principle is that speech which is profoundly hateful is not protected at all. So there is a sort of sludge category of particularly unpleasant speech, such as Holocaust denial, which isn't protected in any way by the convention. And that is speech which falls within Article 17, which says that the convention doesn't impose any duties or obligations or responsibilities on anybody in relation to particularly hateful speech of that sort. Totalitarianism and Holocaust denial are examples which are often given. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Another principle is that, and we're coming back to Article 9 here, is that opinions which are not spoken are almost always absolutely protected. Because as we saw earlier, Article 9.1 gives an absolute protection for the holding of any belief. And the category which it doesn't protect are those beliefs which fall foul of Article 17, so things like Holocaust denial. And this is a really important principle for universities because it comes up a lot. Interference with a person's speech just because they are known to hold a belief that's considered offensive can't be justified unless it's something that falls within Article 17. So if somebody's coming to talk about something which is completely unrelated to their belief in something which, like gender critical thought or something of that sort, interfering with their speech about something completely different is not acceptable. Next slide, please. Under the law, it's not acceptable. So moving on from that whistle-stop tour of freedom of speech, academic freedom. Academic freedom is the fundamental principle of university life. That's in the Magna Charta. And violations of it have always resulted, it is said in that document, in intellectual relapse and consequently in social and economic stagnation. So it's regarded in international instruments broadly as absolutely essential to the academy. Next slide, please. There isn't a single definition of it in law, but the focus is on prohibiting adverse consequences meted out to academics for challenging received wisdom or established doctrine. And the aim of it is to produce knowledge and truth, which may be somewhat controversial, but there it is. In my view, it encompasses two strands. One is expression, so discussing, questioning, testing, and that strand of it falls largely within Article 10, freedom of speech, and is given the utmost protection within Article 10, freedom of speech. And then there's also protection for action, so things like researching, teaching, disseminating, publishing. That has a wider scope than Article 10, freedom of expression. Next slide, please. I'm only going to be talking about the expression strand. Here's one of the definitions in international law, which I'm going to leave you to look at on your own. Next slide, please. And here's another from UNESCO, which again you can look at afterwards if you wish. Next slide, please. In domestic law, we have a current definition in the Higher Education and Research Act. And here we see a phrase which doesn't appear in the international definitions that we've looked at. It says that academic freedom is freedom within the law, which we touched on earlier, to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without adverse consequence. Next slide, please. And that definition with that wording within the law is repeated in the new bill, which is what we're all here to discuss. Next slide, please. So what does within the law really mean? It appears in the domestic legislation, and what it means is if the speech amounts to harassment or discrimination or is otherwise unlawful, let's say it's a criminal offence or something of that sort, it's not protected at all by those statutes. And you'll recall that I said earlier, Article 10 is capable of protecting speech which is outside the law, or at least partially protecting it so that proportionate interference only can be made to it. Next slide, please. So in summary on that, internationally, academic freedom is amongst the strongest forms of Article 10 speech. But in our own UK domestic law, academic freedom legislation is weaker than Article 10 because it only protects speech which is within the law. And this raises extremely complex questions about the scope of universities' duties, which you can read about in learned papers. Next slide, please. I haven't authored a learned paper of this sort, but others have. And one of those questions is, can speech be within the law for the purposes of the new bill, for instance? If in ordinary circumstances it would amount to harassment, but either it wouldn't amount to a breach of Article 10 because it doesn't reach the threshold for interference under Article 10.2, or under Article 10.2 it would only reach the threshold for proportionate interference. That is beyond the scope of what I'm going to be discussing further today, but it's a question which I pose for mulling over at a later time. Next slide, please. I'm going to go back to the easier bits. What is the scope of academic freedom? Who does it protect? Academics only, so not professional services staff within the academy. Where and when does it apply? It can extend outside the institution and beyond the activities that an academic is employed to do. And that includes Twitter. I don't think I've been instructed in a case in the last 2 or 3 years which doesn't involve Twitter. So what an academic says on Twitter can be protected by academic freedom. And I've put here some case law which you can look at your leisure. These are cases from the European Court of Human Rights. Next slide, please. What does it protect? It can include speech which falls outside. So not only can it include speech which is outside the university, but it can also include speech which is outside the academic individual's area of expertise, as long as it has sorry, I had a box on my screen there, as long as it has an academic element. Again, there's some case law there. And there is a test for what an academic element means, which is set out in Erdogan. And it includes, this is vital, it includes the freedom to criticise the institution, the university, and the system, the university system more broadly, because the protection of a university's reputation is merely institutional, so it doesn't carry as much weight. And there are questions arising from that about whether or not contractual obligations not to bring the employing institution into disrepute can be properly enforced. And the balancing of those obligations against free speech is something which does come up. Next slide, please. And how does it work? Or how does the speech have to be presented in order to be protected? It does protect harsh and offensive speech in certain circumstances, but the speech itself has to be exercised professionally. It's a bit difficult to marry these two principles up, but I suppose academics can be harsh and offensive whilst behaving professionally. And behaving professionally includes using established principles of intellectual rigor, scientific inquiry, and research ethics. So it's not really just having a spat on Twitter where you descend into unevidenced straw man offensiveness. It has to be something which is academic, really. Next slide, please. And how can restrictions be made? Even minimal sanctions, even a minimal interference with academic freedom of speech. So this is the academic freedom of speech, which falls within Article 10, can be a breach of Article 10 because it can have a chilling effect. And we're all familiar with the discussion about chilling effect and whether or not that's a real thing. I'm very much in the camp of thinking it is a real thing because I see it in my practice, but others I know aren't. The ideas expressed don't have to be meritorious. And there's a really interesting case on that, Hurtle, which you can look up. So, and that's obvious because, you know, if the aim is to produce knowledge, there are mistakes always made along the way, and we can't just restrict speech because we believe now it not to be meritorious. It might turn out to be, and we heard all about that from John earlier. But the need for restrictions must be established very convincingly. Again, that comes from ACSU. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Aqua. I'm really sorry. We're
running
over time. Yes.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I'll wrap up really quickly if I may, because I haven't touched on harassment at all. I did practice it, and it was 15 minutes, but I've obviously spoken more slowly than I intended to do. Okay. So harassment under the Equality Act has an objective element. It must be always objectively reasonable for the speech which is complained of to be experienced as offensive. It's not enough for speech just to be experienced as offensive. The victim doesn't get to define what harassment is. If you can just go to the end of the slides, then everybody can look through them at their leisure. Next slide, please. So I think there's a summary at the end. Yeah. My basic thesis is that when a tribunal or a court is deciding whether or not something it is reasonable for a person to experience speech as offensive, the circumstances which the court or tribunal will have to take into account include all of the legislation and international instruments that we've seen. They include the fact that a university is a place in which academic freedom is the foundational principle. They include the fact that Article 10 gives the utmost protection to freedom of speech, and so on. So when a tribunal is deciding that whether harassment has occurred, whether somebody was reasonable to experience something that an academic said as harassment, they will take into account the fact that freedom of speech is of very, very high value within the specific context of a university. So universities must very, very carefully interrogate any claims that harassment trumps freedom of speech in a particular circumstance, and very, very carefully justify any restrictions. And I'm sorry I didn't get time to develop that argument, but as I say, the slides are there. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I ran.
And there may be opportunities to discuss some of this in the panel discussion.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm going to turn now to Hilary, the Office of Students, who's going to facilitate that discussion.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on this bitterly cold day. I have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists. I'm going to do so in a way that leaves as much time as possible for audience questions, and that means that my introductions are going to be brief and certainly will not do justice to the amazing achievements and backgrounds of each of our panelists. But we've got sort of longer bios on our website for those who are interested. But without more ado, with my brief introductions, I'm delighted to introduce Ruth Anderson. She's the Chief Executive of the Index on Censorship, and she was Labour MP for Stoke-on-Trent North and Kidsgrove from 2015 to 19. So welcome, Ruth. Patrick O'Donnell, he was the President of the University of York Students' Union from 2020 to 22, and he's currently Account Executive at the Public Affairs and Communications firm Higginson Strategy, where he supports campaigns across the environmental and social change sectors. And Professor Steve West, CBE, he's the President of Universities UK and Vice Chancellor of the University of the West of England. And also delighted to welcome back Aqua Reindorf, whom David has already introduced. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I hope everybody is here. I am going to get straight into our questions. We posed our panel a sort of starter question and have asked each of them to give us sort of their headline thoughts for a minute or so, just to get us started. We very much frame this panel discussion around how can universities sort of balance their free speech duties and also their obligations under sort of equality law. From the questions we've been coming in, I suspect that our panelists discussions may be more wide-ranging, but certainly I think we're in for a very interesting time. So if our starter question, free speech, diversity, inclusion, are universities getting the balance right? Perhaps Ruth, if I start with you, your sort of initial thoughts on that topic.
Oh, I think that's a very brave beginning, and following on from Akua is not straightforward at all. But just to follow on from one of the patterns, one of the things that she highlighted is that there is a difference here between academic freedom and freedom of speech. And I think we've got to be very careful about how we frame the conversation. Are universities getting the balance right? Some are, some aren't. I'm going to go a little bit left field because having followed everything that everyone's been talking about, obviously the Academic Freedom Bill, the impact on how we're going to protect academic freedom on campus, it's incredibly important. And the organisation I'm lucky to to be chief executive of, 50 years ago identified the fact that freedom of academic freedom in the UK was incredibly important to defend so that we could fight for its promotion in totalitarian regimes. So everything for Index is through the prism of what it might look like internationally. The one thing where I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball is academic freedom, freedom of expression online has to apply to every student and every professor that's operating in the UK. And one of the things that we're seeing is that some foreign students are not afforded the same rights, and some universities are dealing with that really well and others are not. So if you look to see what's happening to Chinese students who are having to go to the Chinese embassy to report on other Chinese students under the national security law of Hong Kong, the impact on their academic freedom and on their ability to learn is minimised, definitely undermined. And some universities are dealing with that in interesting ways. Other universities are ignoring it. So I think in the round, it's really difficult area for every university to get it right and everyone to consider exactly what the impact is. But I find it obscene that in the 21st century, some Chinese students are being taught by name rather than number so that they can't be reported back onto their domestic governments. So I think we've just got to look at this in quite in the round, not just what's covered in the Academic Freedom Bill, which is progressing through Parliament at the moment.
Interesting thoughts. Thank you, Ruth, and a great way to start us off. Steve, would you like to follow that?
Thank you. So I think we've already discovered on the journey so far that this is not easy. This is really complicated and may even get more complicated as we move forward. But free speech and academic freedom sits at the heart of what universities do, and universities take their responsibilities in this area incredibly seriously. It is the bedrock of why universities exist. So Universities UK has done a lot of work publishing statements and reaffirming the sector's commitment to upholding freedom of speech and academic freedom, alongside preventing harassment and fostering good relationships between different groups. We made that commitment in partnership with Guild HE, Advance HE, and the NUS and CUC. So that I've got no doubt that everybody is trying incredibly hard to ensure that our universities are truly inclusive, are allowing all students, staff to thrive and flourish and to be themselves within an environment that is about challenge, questioning, and also forming new thoughts and ideas. So I think most universities are doing this well. There will be some universities that are further behind and trying to make sense of getting it right. And of course, we're sharing best practice across the sector. We recognise that in addition to working within the legal frameworks that we already have, of which have been described very well thus far, we have an act that is coming towards us, which we'll also need to take into account. And also at the same time, ensure that we don't lose the whole environment, which is about challenge, the whole environment around questing for new understanding, and ensuring that we're doing this in a way that doesn't create situations within our campuses and on our campuses, such as the one that Ruth's just described. That is not where we want to be, and we need to ensure that we are truly inclusive and all staff and students can thrive. I can go through all the things that we're trying to do in that space across the sector, but fundamentally, are we getting the balance right? Broadly, as a sector, yes, we are. If you actually look at the data would suggest that we are getting it right, but there is work that we still have to do.
Thank you, Steve. And I think a very neat segue to Patrick to give us perhaps a student-focused, student-focused perspective.
Thanks, Hilary. I think, I've got a few thoughts. I think the first one is, really, is the government getting it right? Because, if you ask, in terms of public opinion, I think people care about free speech, but they also care about diversity and inclusion. I wasn't here for the minister's comments earlier, but I think they're, this really hard call banging on about the statutory tort is really, I'm quite uncomfortable with it, really. Steve alluded to universities working well with their students' unions on this, and that was my experience at York. We really tried as a students' union to work with our university management and work with students to have free speech and debate on campus. I was involved in my Labour Club at university, and we had really constructive debates with the Conservative Society and the Lib Dems, and not really UKIP, but they didn't really exist at the time. But we wanted to foster an environment where we could disagree with people and debate with people. And overwhelmingly, from my 5 years at York, 3 as a student and 2 as someone who supported students for 2 years, I think we got that balance right. But it is disappointing to see more regulation on universities and by extension students' unions when we are trying our absolute best And, you know, at York, I think we broadly, as I mentioned, did have, you know, really constructive debates. You know, there were issues that came up, similar to what Ruth was saying. There were challenges to do with some of our Chinese students and students from Hong Kong as well. You know, we've spoken today about gender critical debates, and those are really, really sensitive issues. But, you know, as a students' union, I want to support students to have debates. But if someone's coming to me and saying, you know, this is hurtful, this is shocking or offending me, you know, I want to give them equal resources and equal advice of how they can protest that peacefully, should they wish to do so. So it's about supporting all of our students to, number one, express their views, and number two, to challenge those views peacefully if they wish to do so.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And Aqua, if I may exercise chair and actually ask you to go straight into some of our questions that have come in. And I think a particular question for you, given your background, is that the codes of conduct, for example, dignity at work, study policies, other internal policies, are more likely perhaps to give rise to disputes than speaking events, says our questioner. Such codes have contractual force. Do you agree that universities could not rely on those policies to impose restrictions on lawful but practicably securable speech? So a balance there, I think, contractual obligations, but then what the law says about free speech. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Aqua, sorry.
I see, sorry, I'm trying to find the question written down because I struggled to follow, I struggled to hear what you said. Can you summarize it for me again?
Yes, certainly. University codes of conduct, for example, dignity at work or dignity of study policies, often may give rise to disputes because of their contractual provisions. Do you agree that universities cannot rely on those policies to impose restrictions on free speech?
No, not entirely. It's a balance. It's a balancing exercise. I mean, obviously, your fundamental duty is to comply with the law. If your policy is unlawful, then you can't rely on it. If it's lawful, then you can. But one thing that I also want to say in connection with that is that freedom of speech is an equalities duty. It's not, and one thing that I find very frequently is that it's not integrated into the equalities policy framework in universities. There is a duty under Section 10 of the Equality Act to safeguard religion and belief, and universities very often focus only on the religion side of it. The EDI practice and policy framework needs to accommodate freedom of belief, which includes freedom of expression of beliefs. And so I think if it's knitted together more adequately, then the balance will be more easily found. But I don't think that, it's possible to say that relying on a contractual policy is going to be problematic. It depends on the quality of the policy. Thank you.
Steve, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts you want to bring in there?
I completely agree that if your policies need to be set within the current understanding of the legal frameworks that universities are operating under. And that includes health and safety, it includes the Equality Act, it includes clearly HERO and all of the things. So all policies should sit comfortably in that space. And I don't think if that is correct, and we've then got our own codes of conduct aligned to that, then there shouldn't be a conflict. It should be fine. There's a bit of work to make sure, of course, all universities continually to refresh, update, communicate the codes of conduct and the policies that we rely on, and making sure that they are current. The danger is that often these things sit in institutions of all sorts of different institutions, and they get out of date, and then it becomes an issue.
Thank you, and I think linked and perhaps Aqua, you might want to come in here too as well. we've had quite a few questions around the sort of space of decolonizing the curriculum, or universities signing up to equality charters and the like. Do you have any thoughts? Could you comment on how those sort of matters, if we take, for example, signing up to equality charters, Steve, you may have views on this too, how that might interact with duties on free speech and academic freedom? Aqua, if I start with you, and then I'll bring Steve back in.
Well, I think it can be problematic, but again, it comes down to quality. Universities aren't necessarily in a position to know whether the particular charter that they've signed up to is of good enough quality or indeed is correct. But it's a real problem in a lot of universities, because of course signing up to these things is a recruitment tool, and helps to improve the standing of the university in general. But if the charter which is being signed up to makes requirements of the university which go beyond the law, and go beyond the law in such a way that they end up making the university act in a way which is inconsistent with its free speech obligations, then it is a real problem. And I think that these sorts of charters need a lot of scrutiny. I know that often they can come from places where there's a lot of trust in the organisation which is running the charter or running the scheme, but they need to be scrutinised, and the universities need to make themselves absolutely confident that these things are lawful.
So shall I just add to that? Because I think yeah. any charter that a university is considering and exploring, part of that exploration is around, of course, understanding the legal context within which that's set. But equally, it's also an opportunity for universities to test themselves and to get themselves to check, in effect, where they are in respect to a number of characteristics that are captured within the charter. In the end, they have to satisfy themselves that it's legal, that it's appropriate for their institution, can be applied within their institutions and used in a positive way to support the overall strategy of the institution. And there are many charters, many charters that universities may well explore. In the end, it is the choice of the institution as to whether or not they wish to adopt that charter. And part of it is about challenging themselves in terms of what the charter is offering, and can they apply it in a reasonable way within the institution. So it starts with the charter, understanding it, and then determining whether or not it's applied in an institution in an appropriate context, and that it can be supported. There's no point having a charter that you just sign, but you in the end can't actually use it effectively to shape the institution going forward. So I think, we're seeing more and more charters coming onto the university scene, and we need to make sure that as we look at each one of them, we consider how they impact on each other, because we could end up with charters actually jarring between charter and charter. So this is complicated, and that's why universities need to take their own views and time to really understand all of this landscape.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, if I may. I think it's really important that universities don't just sort of rent out their equality obligations to external providers and trust in external people to understand what's right for them.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and that universities are satisfied that they are covering the full range of their obligations under the Equality Act. And as I say, freedom of speech is an obligation under the Equality Act.
In the end, it won't be the charter in court, it will be the institution.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. I hope everybody can hear me. My Zoom seems to be quite glitchy.
Yeah, it is a bit. I'm going to plow on.
Thank you both. Apologies if my connection is a little bit glitchy. I'd like to turn back to Ruth. Ruth, you mentioned some international aspects in your intro. have you got views then on the free speech requirements that we're talking about now that are going to be imposed on English universities and colleges? Thinking about that with an international perspective in how those might translate to partnerships that universities and colleges have overseas. So overseas campuses, what can or should universities and colleges be doing in respect of their sort of overseas links?
Done that horrible thing that we have done forever. I was still muted, sorry. Actually, the legislation, much to my concern, doesn't address this element of protection of academic freedom or the chilling effect that some international actors are having both in the UK context and in a wider international context. I think when you look at this in the round and you see what's happened in the last 8 months because of events in Ukraine, we are going to have to be much more considered in our approach to university finance and the impact that it has on freedom of expression and the additional pressures, especially in an environment, an inflationary environment when universities are struggling, about who they're partnering with and how they're partnering. And then alongside of which, the impact that that will have on the way in which courses are commissioned and covered. I just want to go back slightly to the example that I used at Oxbridge, where tutorials, students are now being asked not to present their own work in tutorials, so no one can report back on whose views are whose. Oxbridge is already doing it. I'm not sure where else we're considering it. But one of the areas that will run, and this is when Akura is going to know much better than I will, but there is also the National Security Bill, which is currently progressing through the British Parliament, which includes an element of foreign actors and the way in which foreign actors will be obligated to operate. That is going to have an impact on university freedom, university partnerships and university engagement. And I think that I really have done the curveball thing here, and I could happily talk about academic freedom, but it will have an impact in terms of university finance and university approach to debate, both in the UK, but also, as we've seen, the satellite universities that people have done in many regimes that might have had some human rights challenges. And I'm not quite sure that we have gamed out what that's going to look like for a British academic freedom issue, but much more importantly, how that's going to interplay for foreign students and students that, under the auspices of British universities, are being taught abroad.
Thank you, Ruth. Steve, I don't know if you have anything you want to say in immediate response. Very briefly, if I may, because I'm very keen to bring in Patrick.
Yep. Okay. Very, very quickly. I think the difficulty we're going to have is that there are conditions for those of us that are under the jurisdiction of the Office for Students that apply here and now in terms of freedom of speech and protection of that in any of our campuses, wherever we deliver across the globe. That is certainly making universities look at the partnerships and the relationships and how we can assure ourselves that there is freedom. And of course, we are operating in many countries where it is different from our own country. Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland look differently because they're not under the current they're not under the OFS under the current conditions. So we're going to start seeing the UK pulling itself apart if we're not very careful. So I do think this is a very complicated space, and I do think that universities are looking at this very, very closely. So I think we will be making decisions about this. You're absolutely right, because there are potential consequences that will see universities' finances become even more strained because we're having to take some different decisions going forward. Now, that's the big issue, because we'll see universities really struggle and some of them will start to find it difficult to continue.
Thanks, Steve. Certainly lots to think about and consider. Patrick, keen to bring you in here in your sort of answer to our initial question, you referenced government, you referenced the free speech bill. What do students unions think of the free speech bill?
Yeah, I think I want to engage really constructively with any bill that's put forward, and that's what I did for 2 years in my previous role. But I think we need to make things as easy as possible for students. I don't want any bill to have the exact opposite effect and then limit the free speech of anyone coming onto the campus or students, which is the exact opposite of what we want to achieve. And I think we have to be practical and proportionate in what we do. So the statute talk, I think, is completely misguided. I'm also kind of slightly concerned about this sort of independent adjudicator of free speech, director of free speech role. To inspire confidence, that person really has to be independent of any political party. If we want to move things forward, So I think I'm nervous, but I'm really willing to engage, and students' unions have engaged, and we will continue to engage, really constructively, to make sure that we get the balance right. Because I said in my earlier remarks, students overwhelmingly, in my experience, really do want to engage positively in free speech. And as Steve alluded to, those examples of where things might go wrong on campuses, obviously regret those examples, but they are very small in comparison to the thousands of events that happen every month at universities.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we are fast running out of time, which is a shame, because I feel like we could speak for hours. But perhaps just a final wrap-up question from each of you. We know that we have new legislation coming down the line to address concern about research. But if you could think of one long-term thing that you think sector universities and colleges and students could take that would support and champion free speech, what do you think it would be? Patrick, as I have you, why don't I start with you?
Oh gosh, I just think the biggest reflection in me in this, and I've said it before, is please make things as easy as possible for universities and for students. As I said, I'm not against regulation. I'm not against having a conversation. I'm here today at having a really useful and interesting discussion. But I think to make it as easy as possible for students on the ground to host their events, to have challenging and possibly offensive or upsetting debates, but to do that at the end of the day respectfully, we can only achieve that if universities, students' unions, the government, the OFS, we all work together on the same page, rather than kind of having top-down things imposed, which is really disappointing. And my only reflection on all of this is when we were in those successive COVID lockdowns over the last 2 years, to get things from ministers and all these, bills, announcements of free speech and no support for students, as we completely lacked over the last 2 years, was really, really disappointing. So anyway, going forward, I think, support universities to support their students' unions and their students to continue to get this right, as they largely do.
Thanks, Patrick. Steve,
I think I'll build on what Patrick said. I mean, this is only going to work if we've got campus environments that are respectful and trust and challenge, both from a staff and student perspective. There's lots of law that already exists. I question, and I've questioned all the way through this, why do we need something else on top of it? What's the issue we're trying to solve? But if it's coming, then we need actually the person who's going to be sat at the OFS to adopt a completely different approach within the regulatory framework. It should be about learning together, working together to solve issues, not what I fear, which will be a sort of a regulatory approach, which is point the finger, come along, hit someone over the head. That's not going to work in this space. We need a sensible regulator to act as a supporter, champion, identifier of best practice, engaging positively with the sector. Because boy, is this a complex space that we're moving into.
Thanks, Steve. I certainly hope that we are a sensible regulator, but I won't comment in more detail. because this is not for my voice. Ruth, your final thoughts, please.
Thank you. I want to agree with both Steve and Patrick and sort of build on what they've said. I think actually, as with all the legislation that's going through that this government are proposing on freedom of speech, which by the way, they're using 4 different definitions for, they're trying to legislate for cultural change, and I don't think that works. But one of the things, if I had my magic wand and to enable us to have a genuine conversation and about academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus, is have a conversation about what that is. We've had a whole session today where we've not actually talked about why freedom of speech and academic freedom is so incredibly important, both for students and academics. And I think in what can be quite a toxic political environment, we're forgetting the real importance, whether you're on the left or the right, of this this core human right. And I think that if we started, I believe universities to be cathedrals of learning where controversial decisions have to be debated so the world moves on to the next challenge. And therefore you need academic freedom to do that. I don't think necessarily we have to respect each other's views. I do think we have to tolerate them. I think we have to argue and we have to debate. So therefore, let's have an argument and a debate from a social sciences perspective about what free speech and academic freedom should look like on campus. Because if we can get to a point where there's a level of consensus, then regardless of the controversial nature of any of the topics being discussed, we might be in a much better place than where we are right now. And that doesn't require legislation, that requires debate and conversation. I think that might have seen Hilary off.
Yes. Shall I just jump in? Hilary's frozen. I'll jump in another question.
Yeah, no.
No?
I'm here, Aqua, yes.
Oh, you're there.
Please jump in. I'll afford you the last word.
Thank you very much.
Please jump in.
I'm going to come slightly build on what Ruth has said and come back to what I said before. I think that universities need to embed freedom of speech into their general EDI policies and actions in particular, and schemes, so that it is discussed in a way which is intertwined with their equalities duties and the actions that they take, so that that conversation about what it is and how it interacts with other equalities duties can take place in a positive, proactive and constructive manner. So I've kept myself short on that, but I think that's probably the thing that universities need to do immediately. There's plenty, I could talk all day on it, but there's plenty more. But that's the first thing.
Thank you, Aqua, and thank you to all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion. And I can see Susan has switched on to summarise and round us up. So my role here is over. Just to thank each of our panelists for your time, and to hand back over to Susan.
Thank you, Hilary, and well done for beating the technology in the end. Many thanks to our panelists for what I found a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and thanks to those of you in the audience who submitted questions. I've seen them go by, and I'm conscious that there are many that we didn't get to either during that session or earlier, but we will look at them all and reflect and see if there's something useful we can do with some of those points. I'd also like once again to thank John and Aqua for their presentations. John talked about the idea of disciplined speech, which he described as a commitment to evidence, and he argued for the sorts of speech and expertise that should be valued on university campuses. And I think he quite helpfully posed the challenge that institutions should think about the kinds of communities that they want to build. That was helpful, I found, in stepping away from the more technical issues that we've also been discussing this morning. And then Aqua brought us squarely back to the law. So she gave us that really helpful whistle-stop tour of some of the legal complexity. And that reminded me that one of the themes of today is the need for all of us to grapple with this legal and regulatory landscape, not least because it's going to develop further. So I hope we've given you all a prompt to do that and to take a fresh look at some of those issues. I'm not going to attempt to summarise the panel discussion in the few minutes left, but 3 things particularly struck me. First was the interesting discussion about the need to take care in signing up to equality charters, and a warning that I think is right, that universities shouldn't contract out their judgments about the extent to which those charters fit within the law. Second thing that struck me was Ruth and Steve drawing attention to the international dimensions of this issue in terms of international partnerships and recruitment of students, and the potential financial consequences that exist in that space too. And clearly the financial sustainability of the sector is a live issue, particularly at the moment. And then third, Patrick reminded us really importantly that we need to continue to focus on supporting all students to have the confidence to express their views and engage in robust and feisty debate, and that we need to make it as easy as possible for students to do that. So that's the thought I'm particularly taking from the panel discussion. My final thought on the morning is I guess kind of obvious, but I'll say it anyway. This debate about free speech is not going to be concluded anytime soon, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's simply where we are, but it's also a good thing. We should continue to talk about these complex issues, and I'm encouraged by this morning's debate, which I think was characterised by a commitment to engage on difficult issues and a willingness to expose and examine a range of views, some of which we might agree with, others of which we won't. And I think then to end, lots of discussion about the OFS's future role and the approach we might take to that. And of course, we're in Parliament's hands, and we will do to the best of our ability whatever job Parliament gives us to do. But we'll do that really carefully, and we will do it with the utmost of impartiality, because that's the point of having an independent regulator in this sector. Finally, then, a reminder that we plan to make the event recording available on our website from early next week, so do look out for that. And a final plug for our insight brief on free speech, which we published this morning, and also our annual review, which appeared at the same time this morning. Do please have a look at them if you haven't already. And we're going to aim to make slides from speakers available too. So I can see some of you have been asking for that in the Q&A, so we'll do that as well. But that's us done then. So on behalf of the OFS and all of the speakers, thank you so much for coming today and for spending the time with us. I think this won't be the last time we talk about freedom of speech, so I look forward very much to seeing you all next time. Thank you.